So in October, or in August of so in June, the first burials take place in May, and order is signed in June, and in August of 1864, Montgomery Meigs decides it's time to go over to Arlington and see how my little handiwork is going. He wanted to see how many bodies and where they were being buried at Arlington Cemetery. And so as he came across the bridge, and then up the circular lane up to the house, he didn't see anybody. He didn't see any headstones or any headboards. They used boards then. And he was wondering, well, where are the bodies? Well, as it turned out, of course, all the men who were stationed at Arlington, including General McDowell, who was living at Arlington House, they were not going to bury the bodies in the front yard. They had this whole cemetery. They were burying all the bodies way out here. This is where William Crispin is buried, is right there. That's the first burial. And so Montgomery Meigs' plot to put so many bodies into this property so that Lee's could never come back to it was being thwarted by his own men. And so he knew that day, as Quartermaster General, that there were 26 bodies ready for burial back at the Capitol. And he ordered that day to have those 26 bodies brought over to Arlington House and supervise their burial in the Rose Garden. Oops, next one. In the Rose Garden at Arlington. You can see this is Arlington House here. You can see this row of headstones. It goes along here, and it comes around the Rose Garden. That is where those 26 bodies were buried then, and they are still there today. Because it was Montgomery Meigs' intent to never have the Lees be able to move back into their property. In addition to those bodies, he also created a crypt, again, right in the middle of the Rose Garden, a 20-foot in diameter crypt, in which he put the unknown remains of 2,111 people that he had gathered up from other cemeteries and places in the region, brought them in and put them in this crypt in the middle of Arlington's Rose Garden, and put this monument above it. This is now today the official Tomb of the Unknown Dead of the Civil War, but at the time it was intended to just be another impediment from keeping the Lees from moving back into the Rose Garden. In addition to that, in 1863, there was also placed on the property Freedman's Village. Washington, as you may know, it was the southernmost northern city that slaves could go to. If they were trying to escape the South, they all headed to Washington because that was the most southern city they could get to. So suddenly, Washington was being overrun by thousands of freed slaves, escaped freedmen, they were called. They didn't have a job, didn't have any means of employment, so the government set up a Freedman's Village on the property of Arlington House. And it became a relatively large community. There were more than 3,000 people lived there when it was the largest. It had a school that had 900 children in it. There were training centers set up to train blacksmiths, carpenters, shoemakers, and tailors. And there was a home for the disabled. They had their own hospital, several churches, and they farmed the area around the village. So it was a substantial community for blacks on the Arlington property, and it lasted until 1890. But again, this was another move by the government that if we put this village on this property, the Lees could never come back here and turn this back into their home. And so this is where the Freedman's Village was. This was kind of on the lower part. This was kind of lowlands down in here. And then this lane right here is where that ridge kind of starts that you see that the house sits on and kind of goes across up where the Tomb of the Unknown is as well. Here's the Tomb of the Unknown here. And this ridge runs right along here. So this is higher ground, and then this is lower ground down by the river. And so that's where the Freedman's Village was placed. So then the question becomes, what happens to Arlington? On April 9, 1865, Lee surrenders to General Grant, and the war is over. Now, where are the Lees going? What are they going to do now? Could they go back to their property? They wanted to go home, but they apparently knew that there was not much chance that was going to happen, or any time soon that was going to happen, because there was still great animosity toward Robert E. Lee. In fact, as you know, Abraham Lincoln was assassinated on April 15th, died on April 15th, 1865, just a few days after Lee surrendered. And Andrew Johnson became president. Well, Andrew Johnson, of course, had a pretty rough time as president as well, the 4 years he was president. So that by 1869, he had already been impeached by the Congress, although not convicted. And 2 days before he was scheduled to leave office, he signed an order giving all of the Lees their personal property back. All of their personal property and all of the Washington collection as well. He signed the order, thought that was the right thing to do. Well, the radical Republicans in Congress, led by John A. Logan, who was a former general, U.S. Senator from Illinois, and the President of the Grand Army of the Republic, which was the Veterans Organization, was up in arms, passed a resolution to Congress that to not give back the rebel traitors' materials to him, and Johnson capitulated and backed down. So the Lees never did get any of their personal property back. Robert E. Lee died in 1870. After he left office, after the war ended, a lot of people wanted him to run for public office, governor of Virginia, United States Senator, and he chose not to do that, or to take any other public position because he didn't want to cause animosity. He wanted the Union to heal. They fought the war, they lost the war, let's let the Union heal. So he took the job as president of Washington College, which today is Washington and Lee University in Lexington, Virginia. And so that's where he went after the war and served out until he died in 1870, when he's now buried in the chapel on the campus of Washington and Lee University. Mrs. Lee, and he never returned to Arlington House. He did return to Washington in 1869 when Ulysses S. Grant became president of the United States. He invited Lee to the White House to visit with him. And as he came into Washington, he was able to see Arlington House, of course, up on the ridge across the river, but he did not visit it. Mrs. Lee, on the other hand, did visit Washington, did visit Arlington one time before she died. She just basically rode a carriage up to the front of the house, did not get out of the carriage, but several of the slaves who were still on the property, of course, recognized her and came out and visited with her, brought her some water, and then she left. She died 3 months later, and then she is buried with her husband at Arlington House. So then what happens? So now, both of the Lees are dead, but the title, technically, passes now to their oldest son, George Washington Custis Lee. He was an aide to his father. He then succeeded his father as president of Washington College, now Washington Lee University. If you look on your family tree there, you can see how the property title passed to him. So he decided he was not going to just sit back and just let this go. He wanted to clear his family's name, and so he sued the United States government to regain property. He sued them in 1877. It didn't go to trial until 1879, but at trial, the jury found the United States government liable to get, and was ordered that the property be given back to the Lee family. The government appealed that, both on appeal, and then went all the way to the Supreme Court. And in 1883, the Supreme Court ordered, by unanimous decision, that yes, the federal government had taken the property illegally, and ordered the government to return the property in the state that it got it back to the Lees. So if you can imagine now, in 1873, you got 3,000 people living in the Freedmen's Village, 16,000 graves on the property by this time, and 2 military posts. And so, obviously, it was George Washington Lee's intent to clear the name of the property and his parents, and to find the government liable. But cooler heads prevailed, and he negotiated with the federal government, and he sold the property back to the government, or sold the property to the government for, what do you think it was worth? That 1,100 acres that sits across the $150,000 is what he got for the property. Pretty good piece of property to have for $150,000. And the irony of all of this is now, by the time they actually sold it and turned the deed back over, here was George Washington Custis Lee signing the deed to Arlington House and the estate, and handing it off, because it was going to be a national cemetery, to the Secretary of War for the United States government, who at that time was Robert Todd Lincoln, Abraham Lincoln's son. So here was Robert E. Lee's son giving the title to his property to Abraham Lincoln's son. A little irony there. But at this time, what most of us now look at Arlington House as Arlington Cemetery as our most treasured national shrine, and it is. There's no question about it. But what most people don't realize, it was a pauper cemetery when it was first established. Remember, it was established because they were desperate to find places to bury people. And many of the people they buried there were unknown, were freed slaves that had no place else to go, were poor people. They may have died in battle, but their families didn't have the resources to bring the bodies home, so they were just buried in this common pauper's grave over in Arlington. And so it took a long time, and I'm going to finish this up in just a couple of minutes, to go through these very quickly, that to evolve from that pauper's grave to what we know today. And there were certain events in our history that helped that happen. The first of it was the Spanish-American War. In 1898, we went to war against Spain. And for the first time, here were Northerners and Southerners fighting together against a common enemy. And President McKinley had the good sense to offer military officers' commissions to former Confederate officers, to bring them back into the fold of the United States Army. And so that was one of the things. And of course, the Maine was sunk in Havana Harbor, and today that mast sits on the grounds of Arlington National Cemetery as a memorial. And all those graves you see in that photo there are all the men who died when the Maine was sunk in Havana Harbor. Then the government decided that they needed to recognize the Confederates who fought in this war, and they erected the Confederate Memorial, or the Confederate Monument, at Arlington, in Arlington Cemetery. It's a beautiful monument in the cemetery. And there were 482 Confederate graves and spouses of Confederates that were brought together from around the cemetery and from the Soldiers and Sailors Home, which is in Washington, D.C., and put in concentric circles around this beautiful monument in Arlington, and given the special Confederate headstones, which have a pointed top to them. And the folklore that they have a pointed top, so those damn Yankees won't sit on our graves. Then, of course, there was an amphitheater that was established in the Great Rose Garden. This is in the Rose Garden at Arlington in 1868 to have regular ceremonies there. The Grand Army of the Republic, the Veterans Organization, John A. Logan, the president, decided that on May 30th of each year would be Decoration Day, and they would go decorate the tombs of each of the Union soldiers. And of course, today we know that as Memorial Day, and they gathered and had heard speeches and everything in the old amphitheater. In 1920, it was decided we needed a new amphitheater. So our new amphitheater in Arlington is about to celebrate its centennial, but in 1920 it was put on this plaza. And you see here, in 1920, where the Tomb of the Unknown is today, that was not there. It was intended just to be this amphitheater. It was then the following year that it was decided that we would join our allies, who had all the French and the British primarily, had established Tomb of Unknown Soldiers in their countries, and so we followed suit, and in 1922 we put the Tomb of the Unknown. Oops. So here's the amphitheater, here's the main memorial, and here's where the Confederate monument are, in the cemetery. So if you ever get out that way, that's the place to see it. Then we had in 1922 we did bury the unknown soldier within this crypt on the East Plaza. It was a huge ceremony. I think I have another picture here. Yes. Oh, no. Right. So that would happen in 1921. Then following the World War II, we did the same thing, only in 1950, as president, they established in 50 to do a Tomb of the Unknown from World War II, but that was postponed because the Korean War had started. And so in 1958, President Eisenhower officiated over both the interment of the Tomb of the Unknowns from both the Korean War and World War II. The original unknown was the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, because they knew that was the soldier. Now the site is known as the Tomb of the Unknowns, because the other unknowns could be sailors or seamen or airmen. Then finally in 1984, President Reagan officiated in the interment of the unknown from the Vietnam War. But by the 1990s, because of science and the huge effort to find missing in action in Vietnam, and the development of scientific analysis, there was some evidence that they might be able to identify this person who was buried as the unknown for the war in Vietnam. So that body was exhumed and was identified as Air Force Lieutenant Michael Blassie, who lived in St. Louis. And so his family decided they did not want to leave him in Arlington. He is reburied at Jefferson Barracks National Cemetery in St. Louis, Missouri. And that crypt is actually empty now. There is no unknown for the Vietnam War. And it's not likely to ever to be an unknown again. DNA evidence, every person who joins the military now gives a DNA sample so that they can be identified if their remains are recovered. So that's the good news. We're not going to have any more unknowns. The next event that really created a major impact on the cemetery was the death and burial of John Kennedy in 1963. And the reason that they had, after the year after John Kennedy died, 8 million people visited Arlington National Cemetery. At that time, you could drive into the cemetery, and everybody wanted to park right in front of his grave. And so it caused massive, massive traffic jams in Washington, D.C. So that's when they prohibited vehicular traffic. You cannot drive in Washington, in Arlington Cemetery. And it also established that they also had 7,000 requests for burial, 1,000 a week after John Kennedy was placed there. And they couldn't do that, because any veteran was eligible to be buried there, but they couldn't accommodate that. So they had to restrict who's eligible to be buried at Arlington Cemetery. And now you have to have a Medal of Honor or a major medal. You have to be a die in combat, of course, or be a 20-year veteran in order to be buried in Arlington Cemetery. There are also regulations about headstones and burial honors and all those things. And I will say, and I cover all of that stuff, and of course I teach for the Orchard Lifelong Learning Institute. So if I'm not teaching it this semester, but maybe next semester, you might want to take that. So I've gone over my time. Any other questions? Oh, there was one more thing. I forgot. Keep going. John Kennedy's grave. But we know where that is. One more. So here's the Pentagon right across from Arlington. On September 11th, 2001, of course, the plane went into the side of the Pentagon, and now there is a memorial, the September 11th memorial, in Arlington Cemetery for those 68 people who died in the Pentagon and now are buried in Arlington Cemetery. And that was dedicated in 2002 by Alan Rumsfeld, the Secretary of Defense. So,
Thank you, Jim. Maybe we can have some questions. If people need to leave, they can.
yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
Thank you very much.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, if anybody needs to leave, please. I'm not.
My last 3 years of high school were spent at Washington Lee High School in Arlington, Virginia.
Very good.
And there was an ROTC unit, which I joined so I could play in the band. And in 1944, there was a young man who had perhaps graduated from the high school, had been killed in action. And there was a military funeral in Arlington Cemetery. And they asked some of the ROTC officers to go to that. So I was one of the pallbearers, and they buried him and then played taps.
How dramatic.
And that's a chilling experience.
It is.
Wow.
If you've seen the changing of the guard, if you've seen those caissons, because they have 37 burials a day at Arlington Cemetery.
Wow.
37 a day. So you can imagine what it takes to manage that.
I mean, how much of the is any of the Washington collection still around?
Is the Washington collection? Yes.
Yes, you
Washington-
yes.
It is now all in the Smithsonian. Now, all the stuff that was in the National Archives was given then to the Smithsonian Institute, and so all of the collection, what was left of it, is in the Washington, including the bed that Washington died in, the tents that he used at Yorktown. A lot of that is in the Smithsonian Institute now. So that will save.
Over the years, did they recover any of the stuff that was taken?
I don't think so. I think they probably did some, the bigger things. I think the smaller stuff they probably did not. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jim.